Hello YouTube Vintage Stereo Restorers. I know I wasn't going to make many videos on the TW61. It's actually going a little bit slow, but I've had to replace so many parts on the preamp driver board, it's not even funny. But that's the nature of it sometimes. Especially as you get older, like this one's 1966. If you want to make them work well, that's what you have to do. What I found on this one, so I recapped it, retransistored this board, and about 8 resistors that were way out of whack. And I'm talking about, there's one, I think this is the 22K here. It was reading almost 40K. Like, it doesn't, obviously it had taken some heat or whatever, and then the 100 ohm was like 230 ohms, that kind of stuff, really out of whack. But I test them as I go along, replace the bias pots. There's 6 center voltage bias and protection level, so those are all replaced. And the board's working the way it should now and everything, and I'll tackle the preamp. Just thought I'd give an update on that because there's been some interest in it. Anyway, what I wanted to talk about is actually some of the things I've noticed lately about trends in stereo, and I've covered this in other videos, but it seems, for instance, something like this, which is early solid state, right beginning of the golden era of stereo hi-fi, the golden era going up to maybe the late 70s when they started to build cheaper versions, and the sad downfall of Sansui. And I know some of the brands are still around. I was looking at a brand new Wacko at a big box store, and I'm thinking, it looks like the new Pioneer stuff too. And they're made by a contract company. It's not even close to being the same. There is a lot of boutique stereo equipment. If you look at some of the stereo magazines, I'm not like paper magazines, you can see them at different stores. Magazines seem to be a trend that's back, just like vinyl albums. And you'll notice there's a lot of high-end tube gear, turntables, that kind of stuff, speakers. But when I look more at the engineering end of it, and there's some, and this is stuff that's made in low quantities. They're actually using the whole, the topologies might be the right word. They're going with discrete circuits and going with capacitor coupled. If you look at the new NAD stuff, the higher end stuff, it's capacitor coupled. And they're using, like quasi-complementary circuitry. It's amazing. That's back. And of course, tube gear is tube gear. You see some of the reproduction tubes, like the old 2A3s and stuff like that. Anyway, I don't want to go in big deal, but what I've noticed lately is some demographic shifts. I was at a vintage guitar show, and most of the people there were vintage, including me. And there's this long lineup for appraisals of people wanting to sell guitars, going like right out into the parking lot. I know it could have been 80, 90 people. And I'm thinking, what's with all these guys? It's like boomer guys selling off their guitars. I'm going, there's some kind of a shift going on there, because just a few years ago, I know people that are into guitars, and they're buying stuff up, especially during the pandemic, for something to do. But it's once again like taste change, and I'll put it to you in terms of cameras. I like vintage cameras. When I first started taking pictures back in the 70s with a 35mm camera, everybody was telling me there's one camera store in town, and this guy was from Germany, and he was like, oh, Japanese cameras are bad, they're terrible. Well, actually, he was kind of wrong about that. They were actually very good cameras. But the point of the focus of interest in those days seemed to be on the classic cameras with the Z-Cycons and the Leicas and even the Kodak Retina 3 from the 50s and 60s. That was considered collectible, and they went for pretty good prices. And the disposable cameras were the Asahi Pentax and Minolta, Nikon, which those are actually now, they're actually, if you look at it, it's almost a parallel industry to the golden age of hi-fi. The best 35mm cameras were built around the same time as this stuff. Started in early to mid 60s, right through in the 70s. You get into the 80s and you get into stuff that's more automation, electronic shutters, that kind of stuff, and they haven't held up as good because I bought some of them and tried to fix them. One of my favorite cameras is still the Side Pentax Spotomatic and Spotomatic 2. A real mechanical manual camera with a through the lens light meter that takes a screw mount lens. Wow, that's the equivalent of one of these. Now I don't know, it's absurd, but that's whether it's a certain mindset or it has to do with the fact that that might have been their best engineering ever. That I'm more thinking it's a little bit of both, because stuff that came later just wasn't as good. It's just simply that. And now there's very few companies making 35mm cameras, very few companies making solid state gear that's completely discrete. It's a pretty small market. And I understand that Pentax is actually going to come out with a reissue of the K1000. They're going to call it something else, but it's going to be a manual SLR. And they're redesigning it from the ground up because all the people that were around, they aren't around. There's a different company now. And I'm trying to predict trends in the future, and I was having this discussion with my wife in the car coming back from a flea market, and I had tried to buy, somebody had some very nice Heathkit gear, and they wanted a fortune for it, like twice what it's worth, and it didn't even work. But I would like to grab it to work on it. One was an AA100 amp. I really like those, but they are a heavy-duty restoration because of the circuit boards in them. I made an offer and I was laughed away, and I'm thinking to myself, that type of gear, although it's really awesome, people are losing interest in it. And this is just from the stuff I see, something actually Kevin at Skylabs was talking about when he did the tour of his store. He was showing the kind of stuff that sells. And it's the 70s golden era Marantz and Sui. He showed even a Kenwood. He said, some people think I don't like Kenwood, but I like this one, something like that. But that is what is popular. And why is it popular? Because it sounds so good and it works really well. They really hit their stride. And I predict that tube stuff, the mass-produced stuff, the Knight, the Dynaco, the Heathkit, I'm sorry to say this, is going to fall in value. I've actually seen it with one of my dad's hobbies. I'm going to close on this. Back in about 1976, 77, my parents decided to do this deluxe rec room. Build it. We had an unfinished basement, and they wanted to make it sort of like there was actually a store in town that was called Rags for Men, and it was kind of a Charlie Chaplin era themed store. And then there was Mother's Pizza, which was a sort of a Charlie Chaplin era pizza place. And so they had this thing. These are the kind of things that were around when they were kids during the Depression era. And so it was like old furniture, this great big sideboard thing, heavy wood furniture. My dad got into Edison and Victrolas. He got into vintage clocks, Paganot clocks that were built about 100 years ago in the World War I era, and then up into the Depression. And things kind of got hectic. I noticed, like, once we got into the 80s, the prices going up on this stuff because a lot of people were doing that same type of collecting that were my dad's generation. And he still has some of his clocks, but you can hardly give them away. And a lot of these clocks were bought at fairly high prices. I know a couple that were like $600, $800, and you list them for $150 and you don't get one reply. So you actually have collectors hanging on to them right now, right almost to the end. And then they end up, of course, in an auction or something. And I was watching an online auction with a bunch of these clocks in it, Paganot clocks, and the prices they were getting, it was sad. You can see like interest had completely moved on. The millennials, who are the budding force in the marketplace right now, aren't interested in those. They're not many, but they're interested in these. They're interested in golden era stereo. They're interested in black and white photography from the Japanese camera era. They're interested in vinyl. Not everybody, but quite a few. And that's really cool. Anyway, I'd like to just have a little discussion about this. Thanks for watching and listening.